The bank manager glanced at the appointment screen, saw my name, and immediately raised his hand before anyone could sit down. "Please stop for a moment," he said. Just seconds earlier, the HOA president had smirked, reminded everyone that I was a nobody, and acted as though this meeting would finally put me in my place. Instead, the room fell completely silent while the manager quietly excused himself and locked the conference room door behind him. I did not understand what had changed any more than she did, but I knew his reaction had nothing to do with luck. If you have ever wondered how a single name can completely change a professional meeting, stay with me, because the truth was buried weeks before either of us ever walked into that bank. And it all began the day I asked one ordinary question at my very first HOA meeting. It all began on the evening I attended my first board meeting after buying my home in Cedar Hollow Estates outside Denver. My name is Grant Mercer, and I had spent the last 16 years inspecting life safety systems for commercial buildings. My work had taught me that procedures existed for a reason, so whenever I signed anything involving my home, I read every page first. The meeting agenda included a proposed special assessment to improve the community entrance and repair private drainage lines. I had no objection to paying my fair share if the process matched the governing documents. When homeowner comments opened, I stood, introduced myself, and asked one simple question. Could I review the board resolution approving this assessment before the payment deadline? The room became unusually quiet. Monica Hayes, the HOA president, looked at me with a patient smile that immediately made me feel like I had interrupted something important. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "people who understand how associations work know the board has already handled those details." I thanked her and repeated that I was only asking where homeowners could inspect the approval. She leaned back in her chair, glanced around the room, and laughed softly. "And nobody does not get to audit this board." Several homeowners chuckled. Others looked down at their papers. Without saying a word, I felt the embarrassment, but I did not argue. Instead, I opened the notebook I carried to every meeting and wrote down the exact time, the wording she had used, and the names of everyone present. After the meeting, I introduced myself to the community manager, thanked her for staying late, and politely asked how homeowners normally requested access to association records. She explained the online process and even pointed me toward the correct request form. Before I drove home, I submitted the request from my phone, limiting it to meeting minutes, board resolutions, and any document approving the assessment. 2 business days later, I received a courteous email from Monica herself. She thanked me for my interest, explained that some records were still being organized, and promised they would be available soon. The response sounded reasonable, so I waited. A week later, the assessment appeared on my homeowner account, but no documents had been released. I submitted a second request, narrowing it even further so there could be no misunderstanding. The next morning, I received something entirely different. Instead of the records I requested, the HOA sent me a violation notice claiming I had failed to maintain my property according to community standards. Attached was a photograph with a timestamp that immediately caught my attention because it appeared to have been taken before the landscaping contractor assigned to my street had even arrived, making me wonder whether someone wanted me focused on defending a violation instead of asking why the documents I requested still had not appeared. I did not answer the violation notice immediately because something about the timing bothered me more than the accusation itself. Instead, I compared the timestamp on the photograph with the maintenance schedule the HOA had emailed to every homeowner before I moved into the neighborhood. The contractor assigned to my section was scheduled to begin work nearly 40 minutes after the picture had supposedly been taken. I printed both documents, highlighted the times, and placed them in the same folder as my records requests. Rather than arguing about the violation, I replied with a short message asking whether my pending document request was still being processed. Monica answered within an hour. She never mentioned the assessment, never addressed the missing records, and simply wrote that compliance matters and records requests followed separate procedures. Her response was professional, but it also confirmed that every conversation was being redirected away from the documents I had originally requested. I decided to attend the next open board meeting without planning to speak. I wanted to observe how the board actually functioned. What surprised me most was not Monica. It was everyone else. The directors relied on her constantly. Before every agenda item, They looked toward her for summaries instead of reading the supporting materials themselves. When one board member hesitated over a landscaping contract, Monica calmly flipped to the correct page, explained the recommendation, and the discussion moved on. She was not controlling the meeting through intimidation. She was controlling it through preparation. That realization forced me to reconsider my assumptions. Maybe she truly believed she was protecting the community by keeping everything organized. After the meeting, I introduced myself to another director, David Collins, a retired civil engineer. I avoided mentioning the violation notice and simply asked how long the board had been using the current approval process for special assessments. He answered honestly that Monica usually handled the administrative side, while the board focused on policy decisions. She knows the paperwork better than the rest of us, he said. That sentence stayed with me all week. I stopped looking for obvious misconduct and started looking at the order in which decisions were made. I created a timeline listing every email, notice, meeting, and response by date instead of by subject. The pattern immediately looked different. My first records request came before the violation notice. The promise that documents would soon be available came before the assessment appeared on homeowner accounts. Every event seemed to delay my access to the same records without ever directly denying it. Then another email arrived from Monica. She informed me that because my repeated requests now involved governance records connected to financial administration, the association had scheduled a meeting with its banking partner to address procedural questions, and she expected me to attend. Attached to the invitation was a confirmation form requiring my full legal name exactly as it appeared on my government identification before the bank would finalize the appointment. I almost filled out the confirmation form immediately, but one detail made me stop. The instructions did not simply ask for my name. They specifically required my full legal name exactly as it appeared on my government identification, with no abbreviations or alternate spellings. That level of precision seemed unusual for what Monica had described as an informal discussion about HOA procedures. Instead of guessing, I called the phone number listed on the invitation. The administrative assistant at the bank politely explained that appointments involving organizational governance followed standardized identification requirements and that every participant had been asked to complete the same verification process. She could not discuss anything else. Her answers sounded routine, yet it convinced me to complete the form exactly as instructed. I submitted it without adding a single comment. My attorney reviewed the invitation that afternoon. I expected him to tell me not to attend. Instead, he pointed to one sentence I had overlooked. The meeting was described as a discussion concerning procedural authority rather than a dispute over the assessment itself. Notice what is missing, he said. Nobody is inviting you to debate the fee anymore. That observation changed my priorities. For weeks I had been trying to understand whether the assessment had been approved correctly. Now I realized the discussion had quietly shifted toward who possessed the documented authority to represent the association during financial matters. The assessment was becoming a symptom instead of the central issue. I reviewed every email again, this time ignoring the dollar amounts and focusing only on references to governance, authority, and administration. Monica's language had evolved with remarkable consistency. Early messages discussed homeowner questions. Later messages referred to board procedures. The most recent invitation mentioned procedural authority. Each step moved farther away from the original assessment without ever acknowledging that change directly. Even so, nothing I found suggested Monica was acting irrationally. In fact, the sequence made strategic sense if she believed the association had followed the proper internal process. I briefly considered declining the meeting because I still had unanswered questions about the missing records, but doing so would have left the procedural discussion entirely in Monica's hands. I confirmed my attendance instead. 2 days later, another email arrived from the bank confirming the appointment. Unlike Monica's messages, it contained no opinions and no explanation. It simply listed the meeting time, required government identification, and reminded all participants that discussions involving organizational authority would follow bank compliance procedures. I printed the confirmation and placed it beside my handwritten timeline. Looking at the documents together, I noticed something I had missed before. The bank confirmation identified me by my full legal name exactly as it appeared on my identification, while every email Monica had sent over the previous weeks addressed me only as Mr. Mercer. It seemed insignificant until I remembered that she had insisted on collecting my complete legal name only for this meeting. I closed the folder, realizing that whatever mattered about my name had nothing to do with the HOA and everything to do with whatever the bank system would do the moment that exact name appeared on the appointment list. I stopped trying to predict what the bank meeting would accomplish and started preparing for what I could actually control. Instead of adding more notes to my timeline, I removed everything that contained assumptions. The final folder held only original emails, the confirmation form, the violation notice with its questionable timestamp, the maintenance schedule, and my 2 records requests. If anyone asked what I believed, I intended to answer with documents instead of opinions. My attorney approved the approach, but warned me about one mistake that many homeowners made. Do not walk into that bank expecting them to solve your HOA dispute, he said. Banks solve banking problems. If something changes there, it will be because their procedures require it, not because they want to referee an argument. That advice forced me to rethink my expectations. I had unconsciously assumed the meeting itself would reveal the answers I had been chasing. Instead, I began viewing it as a place where different procedural systems might intersect. 3 days before the appointment, another development caught me off guard. Monica withdrew the violation notice without explanation. There was no apology, no admission of error, and no reference to the incorrect timestamp. The email simply stated that the compliance matter had been closed after further review. At first, I considered it a small victory, but my attorney immediately disagreed. Be careful, he said. Removing a weak issue before an important meeting often narrows everyone's attention to the issue someone actually wants discussed. For the first time, I realized Monica was simplifying the battlefield instead of retreating. She was eliminating distractions before the bank conversation. That made me wonder whether she believed the procedural authority discussion would ultimately strengthen her position rather than weaken it. The next evening, I attended another board meeting as an observer. Monica greeted me politely in front of several homeowners and acted as though our previous disagreements had never happened. Her confidence unsettled me more than open hostility would have. Near the end of the meeting, one homeowner asked whether the special assessment would move forward on schedule. Monica answered that certain administrative matters were being finalized with the association's banking partner and that everything remained under control. She sounded completely certain. Walking back to my truck, I briefly questioned my own judgment. If Monica expected the bank meeting to confirm her authority, perhaps I had misunderstood the significance of every document I had collected. That doubt stayed with me until the night before the appointment, when I reviewed the confirmation email one final time. I noticed that the bank had generated the appointment using the exact legal name I had submitted on the verification form, including my full middle name, even though I had never used it in any communication with the HOA. At that moment, I understood that once I walked into the branch, whatever happened next would no longer depend on how Monica viewed me as a homeowner, but on how the bank's compliance system recognized the identity attached to that exact legal name. The morning of the appointment, I arrived 15 minutes early with nothing more than my identification, my document folder, and a legal pad. Monica entered a few minutes later carrying 2 organized binders and greeted the receptionist with the confidence of someone who had conducted meetings there before. When she noticed me, she smiled politely and asked whether I had finally decided to stop chasing paperwork and focus on moving the community forward. I answered that I was simply prepared to discuss whatever documents everyone intended to rely upon. She nodded without another word. For a brief moment, I believed the weeks of tension had settled into a professional conversation. A bank employee escorted us into a conference room and collected our identification cards to complete the routine verification process. While we waited, Monica opened one binder and began explaining that the association wanted to clarify procedural authority so future homeowner requests could be handled more efficiently. Her presentation was calm, organized, and surprisingly persuasive. Even I had to admit that she appeared prepared. When the employee returned, he handed both identification cards back and thanked us for our patience. The meeting officially began. Monica spoke first, carefully outlining the board's responsibilities, the assessment process, and the administrative workload created by repeated records requests. She never called me unreasonable. She simply described my requests as unusually persistent and suggested that centralized communication protected the association from confusion. The explanation sounded balanced enough that I briefly wondered whether I had misjudged the entire conflict. Then the bank representative asked a simple question. He requested the board resolution identifying who currently possessed authority to communicate binding financial instructions on behalf of the association. Monica immediately produced a signed resolution from her binder. The representative reviewed it for several moments before making a copy for the file. Seeing that document placed into the bank record felt like a defeat. I had spent weeks searching for records, and now she appeared to have exactly what was needed. My attorney quietly leaned toward me and whispered that this might be the end of the matter if the documentation proved consistent with everything already on file. For several long minutes, nothing dramatic happened. The representative thanked Monica for providing the resolution and excused himself so he could complete what he described as a standard internal verification. Monica looked across the table with quiet confidence, and I honestly believe the meeting was moving toward a routine conclusion that would validate her position. Then nearly 20 minutes passed without anyone returning. The silence grew uncomfortable. Finally, another employee stepped into the room and politely asked Monica and me to remain seated because the branch manager wished to review the file personally before any discussion continued. Monica frowned for the first time since I had met her, because whatever routine verification she had expected had suddenly expanded into something neither of us had anticipated. I expected the branch manager to walk in with a simple explanation about delayed paperwork. Instead, he entered carrying a sealed compliance folder, shook hands with everyone in the room, and apologized for the interruption before speaking directly to Monica. He explained that during the standard verification process, the bank had identified a discrepancy between the authority resolution she had just submitted and the authority documentation already maintained in the association's banking records. His tone remained completely professional. He was not accusing anyone of wrongdoing. He simply stated that bank policy required every inconsistency involving organizational authority to be resolved before any discussion affecting the association's financial administration could continue. Monica immediately answered that the board had adopted a newer resolution and placed the signed document in front of him again. The manager reviewed it carefully before asking a question that changed the entire direction of the meeting. Was this updated authority ever delivered to the bank through the required governance update process? Monica hesitated for the first time since the meeting had begun. She answered that she believed it had been handled during the board transition. The manager nodded politely but replied that the bank's official records still reflected an earlier authorization package, and that financial institutions could only rely upon documents that had been properly accepted into the account governance file through established compliance procedures. My attorney quietly placed a hand on my folder, signaling that I should remain silent. Suddenly, I understood why the invitation had emphasized procedural authority instead of the assessment itself. The issue had never been whether Monica possessed a signed piece of paper. The issue was whether the bank had ever been formally notified through the required process that its own records should recognize that authority. Every delay, every reference to governance, every request for my exact legal name, and every carefully worded email now fit together in a way I had not seen before. The manager then turned toward me and explained why my identification had triggered additional review. Because I was a homeowner formally requesting records connected to financial governance, my verified legal identity had automatically required the bank to compare the authority documentation presented during the meeting with the governance documents already attached to the association's account. The review had not been initiated because of my profession, personal influence, or any hidden status. It had been triggered by the bank's mandatory compliance procedures once a verified homeowner became part of a governance discussion involving account authority. Monica's confidence slowly gave way to visible concern as she realized the conversation was no longer about persuading homeowners or explaining board decisions. It had become a documentation issue governed entirely by banking compliance rules that neither she nor I could negotiate. The branch manager closed the compliance folder and calmly informed everyone that until the discrepancy was formally resolved through the required governance process, the the bank would suspend further action related to the authority discussion and request supporting records directly from the association. Leaving Monica staring at the sealed folder, while my attorney quietly whispered that the documents I had been requesting for weeks were about to become impossible for the board to avoid producing. My attorney waited until we reached the parking lot before saying what neither of us wanted to admit inside the bank. "This is no longer about proving someone wrong," he said. "Now it is about proving exactly when every governance document became effective and whether the association followed its own procedures before asking homeowners to rely on those decisions." That distinction changed everything. I stopped chasing missing paperwork and started organizing every event according to sequence. The first records request, the delayed response, the violation notice that quietly disappeared, the invitation requiring my full legal name, the meeting that shifted from homeowner questions to procedural authority. Every step now fit into a single timeline that no longer depended on anyone's opinion. Within 2 days, the association's attorney contacted my attorney requesting copies of my correspondence with the board. The request was courteous, which immediately told me the pressure had reached beyond the boardroom. We agreed to provide only the communications already exchanged between me and the association, nothing more and nothing less. There was no strategic advantage in hiding documents that everyone already possessed. The advantage came from showing that my questions had remained consistent from the beginning, while the association's explanations had steadily changed. Later that week, another board meeting was announced. Unlike previous meetings, the published agenda included an item titled Governance Documentation Review. That single phrase confirmed the bank had not forgotten the discrepancy. Monica entered the meeting looking composed, but her approach had changed. She no longer dismissed my questions or referred to me as someone who did not understand association business. Instead, she emphasized that the board intended to cooperate fully with every procedural requirement and complete any remaining administrative updates. It was a careful shift in tone that protected her credibility while avoiding any admission that mistakes had occurred. During homeowner comments, I spoke for less than 2 minutes. I thanked the board for reviewing the governance records and asked only one question. When the documentation review is complete, will homeowners receive the same governing records that I originally requested before the assessment deadline? Monica answered that the board would follow legal advice before releasing additional documents. It was a reasonable answer, yet it avoided the central issue once again. As the meeting ended, Director David Collins approached me privately. He admitted that after the bank meeting, he had started reviewing older board files because he wanted to understand how the authority documents had been managed during previous leadership transitions. He did not tell me what he found, and I did not ask him to violate board confidentiality. Instead, he simply said, "You were asking the right question much earlier than the rest of us realized." Hearing that from someone who had never taken my side mattered more than any public apology. It meant the discussion had finally shifted from personalities to procedures. The following afternoon, my attorney received formal notice that the board had scheduled a special session to determine which governance records would be produced in response to the pending requests, and everyone understood that whatever happened inside that room would decide whether Monica's authority remained intact or whether the bank's compliance findings would reshape the entire dispute. The special board session began with a noticeably different atmosphere from every meeting that had come before it. Monica no longer treated the discussion as a routine administrative matter. Every statement she made was measured, carefully limited to documented facts, and repeatedly framed around the board's obligation to protect the association while legal counsel reviewed the governance file. I respected the strategy because it was disciplined. She understood that every word now carried consequences beyond the meeting room. My attorney advised me before we entered that our strongest position was the same one we had maintained from the beginning. We would ask only for the governing records connected to the special assessment and the authority documents referenced during the bank review. Nothing broader, nothing speculative. When homeowner comments opened, I handed the board secretary a written timeline containing only dates, correspondence, and previously exchanged documents. I deliberately excluded conclusions. Monica reviewed the timeline for several moments before acknowledging that the sequence accurately reflected our communications. That brief acknowledgement mattered because it established a shared factual foundation without resolving what those facts meant. The association's attorney then explained that several governance documents had been gathered for review following the bank's compliance request, and that the board needed to determine which records could properly be released under the governing documents and applicable law. Monica argued that releasing incomplete governance materials before counsel completed the review could create additional confusion among homeowners. It was a reasonable concern, and several directors appeared persuaded. Then Director David Collins quietly asked a different question. Instead of debating whether documents should eventually be released, he asked whether every board member had personally reviewed the authority resolution before it had been presented during the bank meeting. The room became silent. One by one, the directors answered that they had relied on administrative preparation rather than individually comparing the submitted resolution against the association's historical governance file. No one accused Monica of intentional misconduct, but the discussion shifted from defending outcomes to examining process. I realized that the conflict I had started by requesting records had now reached the point where every important decision depended on documented procedure rather than personal credibility. Monica made one final attempt to regain control of the discussion. She proposed delaying any document production until outside counsel completed a comprehensive governance review, arguing that a short delay would better protect every homeowner. My attorney immediately responded that my original records request had been submitted weeks before the assessment deadline, and that repeated delays themselves had become part of the documented timeline already acknowledged by the board. Neither side raised their voices. Neither side argued emotionally. Everything now rested on the sequence of decisions preserved in emails, meeting notices, timestamps, and board actions that had accumulated since the day I first asked to inspect the approval records. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, the board recessed so counsel could prepare a final recommendation on the pending records request and the governance file. And as the directors disappeared behind the closed conference room door, every person in the room understood that the next decision would determine whether Monica's explanation or my documented timeline would define everything that had happened from the very beginning. When the directors returned, the association's attorney placed a written recommendation on the table before anyone spoke. He explained that after reviewing the documented timeline, the board's correspondence, the pending homeowner requests, and the governance concerns raised during the bank's compliance review, the association should produce the requested governance records connected to the special assessment and formally correct its administrative record keeping before taking any additional action tied to the assessment. He emphasized that this recommendation did not accuse anyone of intentional misconduct. It reflected the practical reality that procedural questions had to be resolved before homeowners could reasonably rely on the board's financial decisions. Monica remained composed. She thanked counsel for the recommendation and acknowledged that the board had always intended to protect the community. Then she did something I genuinely respected. Instead of arguing against the timeline that had been established through weeks of emails and meeting notices, she accepted that the documentation process had not unfolded as cleanly as it should have. She still defended her motives, explaining that she believed centralizing administrative responsibilities had kept the association operating efficiently, but she also recognized that efficiency could never replace documented procedure. The board voted to release the records responsive to my original requests, suspend collection efforts related to the assessment until the governance documentation matched the procedures required by both the association and its banking relationship, and complete the necessary governance updates before any future financial action moved forward. A separate motion directed the board to adopt clearer records request procedures so homeowners would receive timely responses instead of repeated delays. My attorney quietly smiled because every meaningful result flowed from the same narrow request I had made at my first meeting. I finally received the resolutions, meeting records, and supporting governance documents that had been withheld for weeks. Reading them confirmed what the timeline had already suggested. The issue was not a dramatic conspiracy or hidden fortune. The problem was that administrative decisions, document updates, and banking governance procedures had fallen out of sequence, allowing confusion to grow until a routine compliance review exposed the inconsistency. The violation notice that had distracted me disappeared permanently from my homeowner file. The special assessment process restarted only after the board completed the required governance corrections and made the supporting records available. For homeowner review. At the following community meeting, Monica addressed the homeowners without excuses. She announced the procedural changes, encouraged greater transparency, and invited residents to inspect future governance records through the updated process. As I gathered my notebook, Director David Collins stopped beside me and quietly said, "The first question turned out to be the right one after all." Weeks earlier, Monica had looked at me in front of the entire room and called me a nobody. Then we walked into the same bank. The manager saw my full legal name exactly as required by the bank's compliance process, stopped the meeting, and followed procedures that no opinion, title, or personality could override. In the end, my name changed nothing by itself. It was the documented process attached to it that changed everything. Records outlast reputations.